The airport was already buzzing long before sunrise. People hurried through the gates, dragging heavy suitcases and clutching coffee cups. Among them was a woman who didn't seem to be in any rush. She moved quietly, almost invisible, like someone used to waiting. Her short gray hair peeked out from under a plain scarf. She wore a faded blue jacket and carried a small backpack, the kind that looked like it had been through years of travel. When the boarding call echoed through the terminal, she stood up slowly and walked toward the gate. No one paid much attention to her. She didn't look like someone who would draw eyes, not loud, not fancy, not trying to be noticed. But if someone had looked closer, they might have seen something calm in her expression, like she was at peace while everyone else was rushing. The flight was from New York to Denver, an ordinary domestic flight filled with business travelers, families, and tired tourists. People chatted about their plans, checked their phones, or complained about the long security line. The woman just kept walking quietly down the aisle when her turn came, holding her ticket gently like it was something delicate. When she reached the middle rows, she could have stopped. There were empty seats there, but she kept walking until she reached the very back of the plane, the last row next to the restroom, where the engine hum was louder and space was tighter. She didn't seem to mind. She placed her backpack under the seat, sat down, and looked out the small round window beside her. The flight attendants passed by, greeting passengers, helping them with their bags, offering polite smiles. One of them noticed the woman sitting alone. "Good morning," she said warmly. The woman nodded, smiled faintly, and said, "Morning." Her voice was soft, polite, and carried a kind of quiet warmth. After that, she didn't say much. She didn't talk to the man sitting across the aisle who kept sneezing, or the young woman with headphones who was scrolling endlessly on her phone. She just kept her eyes on the window as the world outside moved slowly. Luggage trucks, airport staff, other planes lined up waiting for takeoff. When the engines roared and the plane began to move, she tightened her seatbelt and closed her eyes for a moment. There was something about her that didn't quite fit the scene. While everyone else looked nervous or impatient, she seemed completely still, like she'd done this 1,000 times before. As the plane lifted off the runway and climbed higher, she looked down at the small patch of city disappearing under a layer of clouds. Her lips curved slightly, not exactly a smile, but something close. About 30 minutes into the flight, the attendants began their usual service. Drinks, snacks, polite laughter echoing in the aisles. The woman politely refused when they offered coffee. She just asked for water. "No ice, please," she said. Her words were so calm that the attendant paused for a second before smiling and saying, "Of course." She drank it slowly, holding the plastic cup with both hands. Every movement was measured, steady, as if she had all the time in the world. A few passengers noticed her. A little boy sitting 2 rows ahead kept turning around to stare. Maybe it was because of her calm face, or maybe because she seemed like she was listening to something only she could hear. When she caught his eye, she smiled gently. The boy smiled back shyly and turned away. Hours passed quietly. Most people drifted into sleep or got lost in movies playing on small screens. The air hummed with the usual soft noises of flight. The low rumble of engines, the occasional click of a seatbelt buckle, whispers between passengers. But for the woman at the back, it wasn't just another flight. Every time she looked out the window, she wasn't just seeing clouds. She was remembering. Years ago, she had been part of the same world that now carried her across the sky, not as a passenger, but as someone who helped make it possible. She had worked behind the scenes deep inside the world of aviation. She had spent countless nights studying flight systems, drawing diagrams, solving problems that most people never thought about when they boarded a plane. It had been her life, until it wasn't. A long time ago, she had stepped away from it all. People had forgotten her name. The projects she'd worked on had moved on without her, and that was fine. She had her reasons. But sitting there, high above the clouds, surrounded by the familiar hum of the engines, something deep inside her stirred again. A quiet connection. Not nostalgia exactly, but something like respect. She still loved the sky even after everything. The flight continued peacefully. The attendants walked by, checking on passengers. One of them stopped again near the back and asked, "You doing all right back here, ma'am?" "Yes," the woman said. "Thank you. Everything's fine." The attendant smiled and went back to her duties. Not long after, a mild tremor ran through the plane. just a small bump. A few passengers looked up. It was nothing unusual. Turbulence happened all the time. The pilot's voice came through the speakers, calm and confident, reassuring everyone that they might feel a few bumps, but there was no cause for concern. Still, the woman at the back kept her eyes on the wing outside. Her calm didn't fade, but her focus sharpened. She noticed the small details, the slight pitch of the aircraft, the subtle change in sound from the engines. She didn't panic. She simply observed. She leaned back in her seat, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest, and took a slow breath. It wasn't fear. It was awareness, the kind that comes from someone who truly understands what's happening. A few rows ahead, a man started a conversation with the passenger beside him, talking about how he hated flying. "Every time there's turbulence, I think we're going down," he said with a shaky laugh. His seatmate nodded, half listening. The woman overheard but said nothing. She wasn't one to interrupt. Instead, she kept her gaze steady on the clouds outside, now glowing orange from the rising sun. Time passed like that, quietly, smoothly. The plane leveled out again, and most passengers went back to whatever they were doing. The flight attendant started preparing for breakfast service. The smell of coffee drifted through the cabin. Then the woman took out something from her backpack, a small notebook, edges worn, pages yellowed from age. She flipped through it, stopping at a sketch of an aircraft diagram. Her finger traced the lines slowly, almost lovingly. The person sitting next to her, a young college student, noticed and smiled politely. "You like planes?" he asked, trying to make small talk. She looked at him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You could say that," she replied. "They've been a big part of my life." "Oh, you work in aviation?" he asked, curious. "Used to," she said softly. "A long time ago." The student nodded, not realizing that the woman beside him had probably helped design systems that kept millions of passengers safe. To him, she was just a kind old lady with a mysterious calmness about her. As the flight neared its midpoint, clouds thickened outside. The plane shook again, slightly harder this time. Some passengers frowned, clutching their armrests. The woman's eyes flicked toward the wing once more. Her expression didn't change, but her grip on the notebook tightened just a little. The captain's voice came on again, explaining they were entering a patch of rough air and asking everyone to stay seated. Seatbelt signs flashed above. The attendants hurried to secure carts and move passengers back to their seats. The woman closed her notebook and slipped it back into her bag. Her gaze drifted toward the front of the cabin, calm but alert. She watched how the attendants worked, how the passengers reacted, and how the plane handled the rough air. Every vibration, every sound, she registered it quietly, almost instinctively. And for a brief moment, as the plane steadied again, she smiled to herself. Not because she enjoyed turbulence, but because she could still understand it. After all those years, her instincts hadn't faded. When the air smoothed out again, the passengers relaxed. Laughter returned. The young man beside her put on his headphones and started tapping his fingers to the music. The attendants resumed serving breakfast. But for the woman sitting quietly at the back, something had already shifted. She didn't know it yet, but this ordinary flight, this simple seat she had chosen at the far end of the plane, was about to become the reason everyone on board would remember her name. For now, though she just looked out the window, watching the sunlight spill across the clouds, to anyone else she was just another traveler, quiet and unassuming. But soon, when the sky would turn from calm to chaos, everyone, even the pilots, would have no choice but to notice the woman who sat at the back. The flight had been calm for almost 2 hours. Most passengers were relaxed, and the cabin had grown quiet except for the low hum of the engines. A few people were sleeping, their heads resting awkwardly against the seats. The flight attendants moved slowly through the aisle, offering water or collecting empty cups. Everything felt normal, peaceful, almost too peaceful. The woman sitting at the back had her eyes closed, but she wasn't asleep. She was listening. Every vibration, every small sound in the background, she noticed it. The rhythm of the engines, the faint creak of the overhead compartments, the steady breathing of people around her. To most passengers, it was just background noise. But to her, it was a familiar language she had learned long ago. Then, without warning, that language changed. It started as a tiny shift in sound, a faint tremor beneath the steady hum. At first, no one noticed. But the woman's eyes opened instantly. She turned her head slightly, her ears picking up something different. It wasn't turbulence. It was a deeper, uneven vibration coming from the right side of the plane. A second later, the cabin shook lightly. The seatbelt signs blinked on, and the captain's calm voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a little turbulence. Please stay seated with your seatbelts fastened." People groaned softly, annoyed more than worried. A few laughed nervously. One man muttered, "Always when I'm drinking my coffee," but the woman didn't move. Her eyes stayed on the wing outside her window. The right engine looked normal, but the sound, she could hear the uneven rhythm clearly now. Something was off. The plane jolted again, harder this time. A baby started crying somewhere near the middle rows. A few people gasped. The attendants exchanged worried glances but kept their smiles. "Just a bit of rough air," one of them said as she hurried past, trying to calm a nervous passenger. But then came the sound no passenger ever wants to hear. A loud thud, followed by a long, strange whine. The plane shuddered violently. Luggage rattled in the overhead bins. The lights flickered for a moment. The woman gripped her armrest, steady but alert. A few seconds later, the captain's voice returned, still controlled but slightly tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and stay seated. We're experiencing a technical issue. The crew's handling it." The cabin filled with uneasy whispers. A man in a business suit pressed the call button above him. A young woman began praying softly. Even the attendants seemed unsure, moving quickly up and down the aisle but avoiding eye contact with passengers. The woman at the back took a slow breath and looked around. Panic was spreading fast. She could see it in people's faces. Fear had a way of moving through a crowd like smoke, and once it started, it was hard to stop. A few rows ahead, a man suddenly stood up, breathing heavily. "I can't do this," he said, his voice shaking. His wife tried to pull him down, but he pushed her hand away. "I can't breathe." Before the attendants could reach him, the woman at the back was already on her feet. She moved with quiet purpose, not rushing but not hesitating either. She knelt beside the man, her voice calm and steady. "Sir, look at me," she said. "You're okay. You're having a panic attack, not a heart problem. Just breathe with me, in and out." Slowly. The man's eyes darted around wildly, but something in her tone caught him. He tried to follow her breathing. She guided him through it gently, like she'd done it 100 times before. Within a minute, his breathing slowed. His wife held his hand, whispering a shaky thank you. The flight attendants arrived, slightly out of breath. One of them crouched beside the woman. "Thank you," she said. "You really helped him?" The woman nodded, still calm. "He's fine now," she said. "Just give him some water. And make sure he keeps his seatbelt fastened." The attendant smiled nervously. "Are you a doctor?" The woman hesitated, then said quietly, "No. Just someone who's been on a lot of flights." Before the attendant could say more, the plane jolted again, harder than before. A few passengers screamed. The cabin lights flickered once more. The overhead compartments rattled violently, and a few bags fell into the aisle. The captain's voice came back, this time louder and more serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've lost power to one of our engines. Please stay seated. We are trained for this, and we're doing everything we can to stabilize the situation." The air changed in an instant. Fear filled the cabin. People grabbed each other's hands. Some cried quietly. The attendants were trying to stay calm, but their eyes showed worry. The woman at the back didn't panic. She kept her focus on the sound, the pitch of the remaining engine and the faint smell of something burning that had begun to drift through the air. She knew that smell, the overheated metal, maybe oil. She'd smelled it years ago during training sessions in simulation hangars. She unbuckled her seatbelt slightly, just enough to lean forward and catch the attention of a passing attendant. "Tell your captain," she said calmly. "It's the right engine. Oil temperature is too high. You need to switch to secondary cooling before it locks up completely." The attendant blinked. "How do you—" "Just tell him," she said firmly, her voice low but certain.
"Now?" The attendant hesitated for half a second, then hurried toward the front.
The woman leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breathing. She wasn't trying to take charge. She just couldn't sit and do nothing when she could clearly see what was happening. A few minutes passed that felt like hours. The plane still shook now and then, but the violent jerks had slowed. Then the captain's voice returned, calmer again. "We've made some adjustments and the situation is under control. We'll be diverting to the nearest airport as a precaution. Please remain seated and thank you for your patience." A wave of relief swept through the cabin. People clapped softly, a few even cheered. But the woman didn't join in. She just looked out the window, her expression unreadable. The young man sitting beside her turned, still pale but relieved. "That was scary," he said, trying to laugh. "I thought we were done for." She gave a small nod. "The pilots did what they had to do," she said quietly. "They're trained for this." He looked at her curiously. "You sound like you know a lot about planes." She smiled faintly but didn't answer. The flight attendants returned to their positions, trying to calm the passengers. One of them walked to the back and leaned close to the woman. "The captain said thank you," she whispered. "Whatever you told us, it helped." The woman gave a small smile. "I'm glad." But she could tell from the steady hum outside that the problem wasn't completely over. The engine was running smoother now, but not perfect. She could hear a faint unevenness in the sound, the kind of detail only someone who knew planes inside and out would notice. As the plane began its slow descent, the tension returned. People braced themselves, eyes fixed on the seat in front of them. The attendants gave instructions in calm voices: how to tighten seatbelts, how to keep heads low, how to prepare for landing. The woman quietly checked the people around her. She helped the older lady beside her fasten her belt tighter, tucked in a child's toy so it wouldn't fly loose, and made sure the aisle was clear. There was no fear in her movements, only quiet purpose. When the announcement came that they'd be landing shortly, the cabin went silent. The hum of the engine grew louder as the plane tilted downward. Through the window, the woman could see faint outlines of mountains far below. The sky outside was turning gray. The descent was rough. The plane rattled and a few people screamed again. Drinks spilled, trays clattered, but the woman's hand stayed still on her lap. She closed her eyes and whispered something only she could hear. Maybe a memory, maybe a promise. Then with a sudden jolt, the wheels hit the runway. The plane bounced once, then steadied. Brakes screeched. A few gasps filled the air. And then, quiet. Complete, beautiful quiet. When the plane finally rolled to a stop, people burst into applause. Some were crying, others laughing, hugging strangers. The attendants were trying to keep everyone calm, but even they looked relieved. The woman just sat there, breathing slowly. Her hands were still steady, her face calm, but behind that calm was something deeper. The quiet knowledge that she had heard something no one else could. Something that might have made the difference between panic and control. As passengers began to unbuckle their seatbelts, one of the flight attendants came to her again. "The captain would like to thank you personally," she said softly. The woman shook her head. "No need," she said gently. "He did his job. That's all that matters." The attendant smiled, confused but grateful. "Still," she said, "you really helped us." The woman nodded and looked out the window once more. The rain had started, tapping softly against the glass. No one knew yet who she was or how much she truly understood about what had just happened. But one thing was clear. The quiet woman at the back wasn't just another passenger. And soon everyone on that plane, and even the pilots, would realize it. The passengers were still talking about the flight even after the plane stopped. Some were calling family, their voices shaking with emotion. Others were whispering to strangers they had just met, sharing what they thought had happened. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, smiling and reassuring everyone that everything was under control. But one person wasn't talking. The woman who had sat quietly at the back stayed in her seat. She wasn't in a rush to leave. Her hands rested on her lap, and her eyes were fixed on the front of the cabin where the pilots were speaking with the crew. She could tell from their faces that the problem wasn't fully solved yet. They were relieved to have landed safely, yes, but their expressions carried the weight of something unfinished. The right engine was still cooling down. Through the window, the woman could see ground staff moving quickly around the plane, checking the tires and fuel lines. The smell of burnt oil still lingered faintly in the air. She could tell the issue wasn't just a minor fault. It was something deeper. One of the attendants returned, bending down slightly to speak to her. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "the captain asked if you'd be willing to speak with him for a moment. He said you might understand something about what happened." The woman looked up at her, calm as ever. "If it helps," she said softly and unbuckled her seatbelt. The rest of the passengers were still gathering their things when she walked down the aisle, following the attendant to the cockpit. A few people watched her go, curious. The young man who had sat beside her whispered, "Who is she?" But no one had the answer. Inside the cockpit, the two pilots turned as she entered. The captain looked tired but composed. He extended his hand. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "The message you sent through the flight attendant, it helped us avoid a full shutdown. How did you know about the oil temperature?" The woman hesitated for a second before answering. "I used to work in this field," she said. "A long time ago. I recognized the signs. The vibration pattern, the uneven pitch. It's a problem with the lubrication bypass valve in the right engine. It happens rarely, but when it does, cooling pressure can fail before the system catches up." The co-pilot blinked, surprised. "You used to work in aviation maintenance?" She smiled faintly. "Not maintenance, design." The captain's eyes widened slightly. "Design?" "Yes," she said quietly. "I was part of the engineering team that worked on this aircraft model years ago." For a moment, silence filled the small cockpit. The two pilots looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and respect. "I didn't mean to interfere," she added, "but I recognized what was happening. I thought it might help." The captain nodded slowly. "It did more than help," he said. "You saved us time we didn't have." She shook her head. "You saved the flight. I just gave you a direction." There was something humble and grounded about her voice. No pride, just calm truth after a short conversation. The captain thanked her again and said he would report the situation to the engineers waiting outside. The woman quietly stepped out of the cockpit and back into the cabin. Most of the passengers had already disembarked. She collected her backpack and walked toward the door. Before she stepped out, one of the attendants stopped her. "You really know about airplanes, don't you?" she asked softly. The woman smiled a little. "I used to know," she said. "I guess I still remember a few things." Then she walked down the stairs onto the tarmac, the wind brushing against her hair. The sky above was heavy with clouds, but she looked up for a long moment before heading toward the terminal. Inside the airport, she found a quiet corner near a large window and sat down. Through the glass, she could see the damaged aircraft parked on the edge of the runway. Technicians surrounded it, working under the wing. She knew what they were doing, running diagnostics, testing pressure valves, checking data logs. She sat there for nearly an hour just watching, a few seats away. A couple of passengers from the flight were talking about her. "That lady in the back, she told the crew something that helped them land," one of them said. The captain said so himself. The other person looked toward her. "Her? The one sitting there?" "Yes, she's the reason we're all safe." The woman didn't turn. She wasn't listening for praise. She was lost in thought. After a while, a man in a suit approached her. His badge showed he was from the airline's technical department. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely. "The captain told us you might have worked on this aircraft model. We'd like to ask you a few questions if you don't mind." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Of course." They walked together to a small operations office near the gate. Inside, several engineers sat around a table reviewing reports. When she entered, a few of them looked up curiously. The man introduced her briefly, saying she might have insight into the engine failure. One of the younger engineers asked, "You used to work on this model?" "Which system?" "The propulsion control interface," she said. "The automatic oil pressure regulator was part of my team's design. I remember it well." She walked to the table, scanning the printed data logs they had laid out. Her eyes moved quickly across the numbers. Then she pointed to one of the readings. "Here," she said. "Oil pressure drop began 20 seconds before the system alert. That's too late. The bypass valve lagged. It's an old issue. It happened during testing in the early days, but we thought we'd fixed it." The engineers leaned closer, intrigued. She explained the sequence calmly, drawing a quick sketch on a notepad to show how the pressure loop could fail under certain temperature conditions. Her explanations were simple but precise. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then one of the engineers said softly, "You just solved what we were about to spend weeks figuring out." She smiled faintly. "I didn't solve it," she said. "I just remembered it." The lead engineer shook his head. "Still, this is remarkable. You've just given us something vital." She closed the notepad gently. "I'm glad if it helps. Planes are like people. You have to listen to them carefully. They tell you when something's wrong, just not in words." Everyone in the room went quiet. It was such a simple statement. but it carried a weight that only experience could give. After the discussion, she thanked them for their time and quietly left. The engineers stood watching her go, still a little amazed. Outside, the airport had returned to its usual rhythm, announcements echoing, travelers rushing by, the sound of wheels rolling on the floor. But for her, the world felt different. She hadn't meant to draw attention to herself. She had only wanted to take a quiet flight. Yet somehow, fate had put her right where she was needed again. As she walked through the terminal, her phone buzzed with a message from her sister. "Did you reach safely?" She smiled faintly and typed back, "Yes, just a little delay." "I'm fine." She didn't mention the emergency. She didn't mention the pilots or the engine or the people who had thanked her. To her, it wasn't something to boast about. It was simply what she knew how to do. Later that evening, as she sat in a small cafe near her hotel, she overheard a news report playing on the television behind the counter. The headline read, "Flight lands safely after mid-air engine issue." The reporter's voice described how the pilots had handled the situation with remarkable calm, how no passengers were injured, and how experts were investigating the cause. The woman listened quietly, sipping her tea. They didn't mention her, of course. That didn't bother her. She didn't want her name in headlines. The important thing was that everyone had gone home safely. She looked out the window. The sky had cleared, revealing a deep orange sunset. The sight brought back old memories, nights spent in hangars, working under harsh lights, sketching designs, arguing over details that most people would never notice but could one day save a life. She missed those days sometimes. Not the long hours or the deadlines, but the feeling of purpose, the knowledge that what she did mattered, even if no one ever knew her name. As the cafe grew quieter, she thought about the young engineers she had met earlier. They had reminded her of herself when she was younger, driven, curious, hopeful. Maybe that was why she had stayed to help. Maybe she just wanted to pass something on. When she finally left, the night air was cool and peaceful. She walked slowly back to her hotel, her small backpack over one shoulder. The world around her carried on, unaware that the quiet woman walking alone had helped save a plane full of people just hours before. She didn't need recognition. But the truth was, her story was only beginning to spread. The pilots had already told the airline management what had happened. By morning, her name would be known throughout the aviation department, and soon, even the public would learn about the woman who had once sat silently at the back of a plane until the sky itself called her back to duty. The morning after the flight, the airline office was already buzzing with activity. Engineers, pilots, and managers moved through the hallways, speaking quickly into phones and checking screens filled with flight data. The incident from the previous day had sparked concern and curiosity. A mid-air engine issue was rare, and the fact that it had been handled so efficiently made everyone wonder how exactly the situation had been controlled. Meanwhile, the woman sat quietly in the corner of a small conference room. A few airline staff members had asked her to come in to review her account of what happened. She wasn't uncomfortable with attention, but she didn't seek it either. Her calmness seemed to contrast sharply with the tension in the room. The chief engineer approached her, carrying a tablet with the flight's data log. "We reviewed the data from yesterday," he said. "The sequence matches what you described. The bypass valve lagged just like you said. I don't know how you knew that from your seat at the back." She shrugged softly. "I've spent a long time listening to planes," she said simply. "Every hum, every vibration, every small shift in sound tells you something. You just have to pay attention." The engineers exchanged glances. One of them muttered, "We spent years analyzing these systems." She noticed it instantly. She didn't reply. She just studied the data, pointing to the lines showing pressure drops and valve response times. Her finger traced the sequence slowly, deliberately. "See this?" she said. "This drop happened 20 seconds before the alert. That's not much, but in flight, 20 seconds can make all the difference." The room was silent for a moment. The crew had dealt with emergencies before, but hearing it explained so clearly by someone who had recognized it instantly impressed them. The captain had relied on her guidance through the flight attendants, and now her explanation in person reinforced just how crucial those moments had been. A young engineer asked, "Were you trained to handle emergencies like that?" She shook her head. "Not exactly. I worked on design, not operations. But design teaches you to understand the systems inside and out. When something goes wrong, Knowing how it's supposed to behave helps you predict what might happen next. The chief engineer nodded slowly. You essentially guided the pilots through the technical problem, even though you weren't required to. That's remarkable, she offered a small smile. I didn't guide them. I just spoke what I knew. Back at the airport, the pilots had returned to the lounge to complete paperwork and brief the ground crew. One of the pilots asked quietly, "Do you think she'll tell anyone outside the airline?" The other shook his head. No, that's not her style. She's calm, quiet, doesn't need recognition, but she made a huge difference. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if she saved lives before and no one knew. They both paused, remembering the last moments of the flight, the panic, the shaking, the way the woman had calmly helped passengers who were terrified, the way she had guided the attendants with a voice that demanded attention but not fear. Meanwhile, the woman walked through the terminal quietly. People passed her, some glancing briefly but most too preoccupied with their own travel plans to notice. To them, she was just another traveler, carrying her small backpack looking slightly worn but composed. She liked it that way. She didn't want to be the center of attention. She never had, but for those who had been on that flight, she would become unforgettable. They would talk about the calm woman at the back, the one who had helped when the sky seemed to turn against them. Even if she didn't know it, her presence had left a mark. The airline management soon asked her if she would consider sharing her experience in a training session for crew and engineers. They wanted others to benefit from her knowledge and instincts. She agreed, on the condition that it would be low-key and focused on learning rather than recognition. Her first session took place in a small room filled with flight attendants, pilots, and technical staff. She started by talking about the flight, not as a story of fear but as a lesson in observation. She explained how subtle changes in sound and vibration can indicate a problem. She described how remaining calm in a crisis is as important as knowing the technical details. I know it sounds simple, she said softly, but when passengers panic, the crew has to manage both the technical problem and the people. You can handle one, but both together require clear thinking and patience. That's what makes the difference. The room was quiet. Some of the attendants nodded slowly, thinking about their own experiences in turbulent or emergency situations. The pilots asked questions and she answered them calmly, explaining why she had spoken to the crew through the flight attendants and how a small observation at the right time could save precious minutes. Later, she moved on to explain a bit of the technical background, carefully avoiding jargon, using simple diagrams and sketches on a whiteboard. She demonstrated how an engine's lubrication system could fail under certain conditions and why early recognition matters. The younger engineers were fascinated. She could see the excitement in their eyes, the same excitement she had once felt when working on her first aircraft design. She realized that she was passing on more than technical knowledge. She was passing on the attitude, the careful attention, the patience that had kept her calm in a real crisis. After the session, a senior flight attendant approached her. "I've never seen anyone so calm in an emergency," she said. "You didn't just help passengers, you helped the crew manage fear." "That's incredible." The woman smiled faintly. "I just did what I could. Everyone else did their jobs too. The pilots, the crew, we all worked together." The flight attendant nodded, but she didn't look convinced. She had been part of many flights, many emergencies, and yet there was something different about the woman at the back, something she couldn't explain. Days passed, but the story of the flight lingered in the minds of those involved. Crew members talked quietly in break rooms, remembering how she had guided them. Pilots mentioned it in meetings, praising the calm, knowledgeable passenger who had made such a difference. Even the technical department shared the data she had helped explain. The woman returned to her routine quietly. She didn't seek attention. She didn't want interviews or recognition, but she stayed in touch with a few of the crew members she had worked with during the training session. They asked her questions, shared concerns, and she responded patiently, always calm, always gentle. One morning she received a message from the captain of the flight. It was short, "Thank you. I hope you know how much you helped. We will never forget it." She read it quietly and smiled. That was enough. She didn't need more. That evening she sat by a small lake near her hotel, watching the water ripple in the fading sunlight. She thought about the passengers on the flight, their fear, their relief, their gratitude. She thought about the crew, the engineers, the pilots. Everyone had played a part. But somehow fate had put her in the right place at the right time. She remembered the moment she first realized something was wrong on the plane. The sound of the engines, the vibration through the floor, the faint smell of overheated oil. She had recognized it instantly. It had been instinct, training, memory, and experience all at once. And it had worked. She didn't dwell on the idea of heroism. She had never thought of herself as a hero. She had just listened, observed, and acted when it mattered. That was enough. As night fell, the airport lights reflected on the water. She felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. She had always loved the sky, always loved the way a plane could rise into the clouds, carrying people safely to their destinations. Yesterday, she had been part of that journey in a very real way. And though the world might not know her name, she knew she had done something that mattered. The following week, the airline officially recognized her contribution, not with headlines or public announcements, but internally. A small note was sent to the crew, praising her quick thinking and calm presence. A few engineers mentioned her in their reports. And even though she had remained largely unknown, her impact was already spreading quietly through the organization. Passengers who had been on the flight sometimes reached out through social media or letters. "Thank you for staying calm," one wrote. "I don't know what we would have done without you." She read them politely, thanked them briefly, and moved on. She didn't need the recognition. She only wanted to know that her knowledge and instincts had helped someone, somewhere, when it mattered most. And as she walked through the quiet streets near her hotel, she realized that sometimes the most important moments in life were the ones that went unnoticed, the ones where courage was quiet, knowledge was shared without pride, and calm was more powerful than panic. The woman at the back had sat silently for most of the flight. She had not drawn attention to herself. But when the moment came when the sky itself demanded action, she had been ready. And from that day forward, those who had seen her in action, the crew, the pilots, the passengers, would never forget the quiet woman who had turned chaos into calm. Her story was only just beginning to ripple outward, quietly, slowly, but with an impact that would last long after the memory of the flight itself faded.